Across the mapped reaches of the universe there exists a promise that order can be engineered, not discovered, not grown, but imposed with clarity and precision. The Green Lantern Corps emerges from this promise as an architecture of certainty, a luminous network meant to hold chaos at bay. Its symbols are simple: a ring, a color, a vow repeated until it feels older than the voice that speaks it. This is not a myth of heroism at first glance. It is a myth of administration, a system that believes the universe can be stabilized through structure, delegated authority, and the careful distribution of force. Before crisis appears, before rebellion takes shape, the Corps already occupies its throne. Not a seat of vanity, but a center of gravity. The Guardians stand above history rather than within it, watching the universe as one watches a map. Sectors become units. Lives become variables. Conflict becomes a logistical problem. The promise is seductive because it feels clean. Fear is quantified. Will is measured. Judgment is standardized. In this world, morality is not debated. It is enforced. The Corps does not begin as a weapon. It begins as a solution, an answer to the unbearable weight of disorder. In a universe defined by expansion and collision, the idea of a stable perimeter feels like mercy. The rings do not choose saints. They choose those who can endure pressure, those who can carry the burden of enforcement without flinching. The Corps is less concerned with virtue than with capacity. Can this individual hold the line? Can they remain functional while acting as an extension of a system larger than their own doubts? This is the terrain before fracture, a vast territory patrolled by certainty. The Guardians do not ask whether their vision of order is just. They assume it is necessary. Necessity becomes their shield, and from that assumption grows an illusion that will later crack under its own weight. Moral certainty thrives where questioning feels like sabotage. In this early equilibrium, dissent has not yet learned its language. The lanterns themselves are not yet divided. They move within the system like cells in a body that has never known disease. Identity is fused with function. To be chosen is to belong. To belong is to be validated. The ring does not merely grant power. It grants meaning. It tells its bearer that their will aligns with something larger, something righteous. The danger of this alignment is invisible at first. It feels like harmony. In this world, fear is treated as an external force, something to be subdued rather than understood. The Corps frames the universe as a battlefield between order and entropy, between control and collapse. There is little room for ambiguity. Ambiguity slows response time, and so the system trains itself to see clearly, decisively, and without hesitation. What cannot be categorized is pushed to the margins. What resists classification becomes suspect. The Guardians believe they have transcended emotion. They speak of balance while standing far above the ground where consequences land. Their distance is framed as wisdom. Their restraint is framed as maturity. But distance also creates blindness. When one rules from orbit, the texture of lived experience becomes abstraction. Justice becomes an equation. Suffering becomes collateral. This is not cruelty in the traditional sense. It is something colder, a confidence that the system knows better than the individuals within it. The Corps expands not through conquest, but through invitation. Worlds are folded into its jurisdiction with the promise of protection. The lantern light becomes a boundary marker. Inside the perimeter, order reigns. Outside it, chaos is implied. This spatial logic mirrors a psychological one. The Corps defines itself by what it excludes. Everything beyond its authority is framed as threat. Everything within is assumed to be manageable. At this stage, the conflict is not yet personal. It is structural. The illusion of moral certainty is embedded in the foundation. When order is treated as an absolute good, enforcement becomes sacred. The ring does not ask why a command is given. It asks only whether the bearer has the will to execute it. Will becomes both virtue and weapon. The line between conviction and domination remains comfortably blurred. From the outside, the core appears luminous and unified. From within, it operates on faith. Faith in the guardians. Faith in the system. Faith that the universe can be held together by enough force applied in the right places. This faith is not naive. It is cultivated. It is reinforced through ritual, repetition, and the constant presence of threat. Peace is always provisional. Order must always be defended. What has not yet been acknowledged is the cost of this arrangement. To maintain cosmic order, someone must decide what order looks like. Someone must define the acceptable range of existence. The core positions itself as neutral, but neutrality is a posture, not a fact. Every boundary drawn implies a judgment. Every intervention reshapes the terrain it claims to stabilize. This is the calm before self-awareness, the moment where the system still believes in its own reflection. The lantern light casts long shadows, but no one is yet looking at them. The core has not yet been forced to confront the difference between protecting life and controlling it, between preventing collapse and denying change. The universe appears orderly because dissent has not yet found its voice. Soon the pressure will increase, not from an external enemy alone, but from within the architecture itself. From the human ego embedded in a cosmic machine. From the realization that moral certainty, once weaponized, becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. But for now the light holds. The illusion remains intact, and the system continues to patrol its territory, unaware that the fracture is already written into its design. The Green Lantern core does not emerge from myth in the traditional sense. It does not rise from prophecy, bloodline, or divine accident. It is engineered. Conceived as a corrective mechanism, it reflects a belief that chaos is not a mystery to be lived with, but a malfunction to be repaired. This origin matters because it shapes everything that follows. The core is not born from narrative necessity, but from administrative anxiety. It exists because someone looked at the universe and decided it required supervision. The guardians position themselves as custodians of balance, yet their balance is static. It favors preservation over transformation. Their psychology is defined by a fear of regression, of returning to a universe where power was unchecked and consequence uncontrolled. In response, they construct a system that externalizes responsibility. The ring becomes the medium through which will is converted into action. The bearer becomes an instrument. Choice remains present, but it is framed within a narrow corridor of acceptable outcomes. This structure creates a peculiar psychological contract. The lantern is empowered precisely to the extent that they surrender authorship. They act, but not as originators. They enforce, but not as legislators. Their identity is split between individual experience and institutional role. The uniform reinforces this division. Names fade behind symbols. Faces are interchangeable across sectors. The self becomes secondary to function. For many lanterns, this arrangement offers relief. The burden of moral deliberation is heavy. To act without hesitation feels virtuous. The core provides clarity where life often offers none. Orders arrive pre-justified. Threats are predefined. The lantern need only supply resolve. This dynamic rewards those who equate certainty with strength. Doubt becomes weakness. Reflection becomes delay. Human lanterns, however, introduce a destabilizing variable. They arrive not from cultures shaped by cosmic distance, but from worlds saturated with contradiction. Their psychology is less insulated. They carry unresolved conflicts, unprocessed trauma, and a deeply ingrained attachment to narrative meaning. When they wield the ring, they do not become neutral agents. They become amplifiers of their internal landscape. Hal Jordan embodies this tension with particular intensity. Chosen for his will, he is also marked by loss. His psyche is structured around control as compensation. The ring responds eagerly to such will, but it does not discriminate between courage and compulsion. Jordan does not simply enforce order. He seeks to perfect it. Where the guardians see containment, he imagines completion. Where the core sees maintenance, he senses an opportunity for total resolution. This distinction is subtle at first. Jordan's actions align with the core's objectives. His effectiveness reinforces trust. Success becomes confirmation. The system rewards those who exceed its expectations, even when they do so by pushing against its unspoken limits. This is how cracks form. Not through rebellion, but through over-identification. The core assumes that will is morally neutral. It treats determination as a resource, but will is always directed. It carries intention, desire, and fear. When amplified by cosmic power, these qualities do not dissolve. They scale. The lantern ring does not correct the psyche. It obeys it. This creates an asymmetry between power and insight. The core equips its agents to reshape reality without requiring them to confront the inner forces driving their choices. Other lanterns reflect different facets of this dynamic. Some internalize the system so completely that their individuality erodes. They become perfect executors, efficient, predictable, empty. Others resist in quieter ways, bending orders, interpreting directives loosely, attempting to reconcile the core's mandate with local realities. These micro-acts of discretion reveal an underlying truth. Moral certainty cannot be universally applied without distortion. The guardians, observing from above, interpret deviation as noise. They believe that distance grants objectivity. Their long lifespan reinforces this belief. Time flattens nuance. Individual suffering blurs into statistical variance. The guardian's psychology becomes increasingly abstract. They no longer experience consequence. They manage it. This detachment allows them to rationalize increasingly extreme measures. When faced with threats that do not respond to conventional enforcement, they escalate. New colors are introduced. New entities are authorized. Each expansion is framed as necessity. Each compromise is temporary. The system grows more complex, more brittle, more convinced of its own indispensability. At the symbolic level, the core functions as a mirror of institutional power. It reflects the human tendency to mistake order for virtue, to believe that structure equals morality, to assume that stability is always preferable to upheaval. The lantern myth resonates because it dramatizes a familiar psychological temptation, the desire to end conflict by controlling its conditions. Fear plays a central role in this foundation, even when denied. The core positions itself as the antidote to fear, yet its existence is motivated by it. Fear of chaos, fear of unpredictability, fear of losing control. This fear is displaced outward. Enemies are identified. Threats are named. The internal source remains unexamined. As the emotional substrate of the system, fear creates rigidity. Adaptation becomes difficult. When confronted with challenges that expose the limits of enforcement, the core responds not with reflection, but with intensification. More power, tighter oversight, fewer questions. This is the logic of escalation. It feels proactive. It is, in fact, reactive. The Lantern Oath encapsulates this psychology. It speaks of darkness, yet presumes that darkness exists independently of the speaker. It frames the lantern as a light bearer, not as a participant in shadow. This division simplifies moral experience. It allows the lantern to externalize evil, to fight without introspection, to believe that their role absolves them from examining the impulses that drive their actions. Culturally, this narrative aligns with a broader fascination with righteous authority, the fantasy of a force that intervenes decisively, without political friction or moral ambiguity. The core offers a universe where governance is clean, where justice is swift, where oversight is centralized and benevolent. It is an appealing myth, particularly in times of perceived disorder. Yet embedded within this appeal is a contradiction. Absolute authority depends on absolute certainty, and certainty resists challenge. The core's structure discourages dissent not through overt repression, but through moral framing. To question the system is to endanger the universe. To hesitate is to invite collapse. This creates a psychological environment where loyalty becomes synonymous with virtue. The seeds of conflict are planted here, in the assumption that order must be maintained at all costs, in the belief that power, when wielded with conviction, cannot corrupt, in the refusal to acknowledge that the line between protection and domination is not fixed but negotiated. The core does not prepare its members for this negotiation. It trains them to ignore it. As the narrative foundation solidifies, the stage is set for polarization, not between heroes and villains alone, but between competing visions of what order means, between containment and transformation, between obedience and authorship, between a system that demands submission and individuals who cannot fully surrender their agency. The core stands as a monument to a particular psychological solution. It is vast, luminous, and deeply persuasive, but beneath its surface lies an unresolved tension, a human ego amplified to cosmic scale, a moral framework that cannot account for its own blind spots. When pressure increases, this foundation will not bend. It will fracture. The first rupture does not arrive as an invasion. It arrives as excess. The system functions too well. The Green Lantern Corps expands its reach, refines its protocols, and accelerates its response time until intervention becomes instinctive. Conflict is no longer something to be understood. It is something to be neutralized before it can speak. In this phase, the core mistakes efficiency for wisdom and speed for clarity. Crises erupt across sectors, and the lanterns respond with increasing confidence. Each success reinforces the belief that the model is sound, that authority, when centralized and decisive, prevents suffering. Yet with every intervention, the core reshapes the terrain it claims to protect. Local systems lose autonomy. Cultural rhythms are disrupted. Resistance is labeled instability. The lantern light becomes a permanent presence rather than an emergency measure. This is where the psychological shift begins. The lantern is no longer a guardian standing at the boundary. He becomes an occupying force within the territory. The distinction matters. A boundary suggests respect for difference. Occupation implies ownership. The core rarely articulates this change, but it is felt. Worlds comply outwardly, while resentment accumulates beneath the surface. Hal Jordan thrives in this environment. His effectiveness peaks when ambiguity collapses. The clearer the threat, the stronger his resolve. The ring responds with flawless obedience. Constructs sharpen. Decisions accelerate. What once felt like service begins to feel like authorship. Jordan does not merely execute the will of the core. He interprets it. He refines it. He imagines what order could look like if hesitation were removed entirely. The Guardians observe his performance with interest rather than concern. From their vantage point, Jordan represents an asset, a proof of concept, a lantern whose will aligns seamlessly with the Core's objectives. They do not see obsession. They see commitment. They do not see control issues. They see leadership potential. This misreading is structural, not personal. The system is designed to reward escalation. As Jordan's authority grows, so does his internal narrative. He begins to experience the universe less as a collection of autonomous entities and more as a problem set awaiting resolution. Disorder becomes intolerable. Compromise feels like failure. The ring amplifies these tendencies without restraint. It does not question intention. It manifests it. Other lanterns notice the shift before the Guardians do. Some feel overshadowed. Others feel relieved. Jordan's decisiveness simplifies their own moral burden. When one lantern takes responsibility for the hard choices, others can follow without reflection. This dynamic mirrors a familiar psychological pattern. Collective agency dissolves when a single figure embodies certainty. The Core, as an institution, leans into this concentration of will. Crises are routed through Jordan. Authority becomes informal but real. A gravitational center forms around him. This is not a coup. It is an emergent hierarchy. The system reorganizes itself around the individual who best expresses its underlying impulse. At the same time, opposition emerges at the margins. Former lanterns, alien civilizations, entities shaped by fear rather than will. They do not simply resist the Core's presence. They articulate an alternative reading of reality. They claim that the Core's order is not neutral, that its interventions erase difference, that its certainty is a form of violence. The Core responds predictably. Opposition is framed as corruption. Dissent becomes pathology. The narrative simplifies. There is light and there is threat. This binary is psychologically efficient. It eliminates the discomfort of ambivalence. It allows the lanterns to act without confronting the possibility that resistance might be meaningful rather than malicious. Jordan internalizes this binary completely. Where others still experience moments of doubt, he experiences clarity. His ego fuses with the mission. The ring becomes not a tool, but an extension of identity. To question the Core now feels like a personal attack. To oppose Jordan feels like an attack on order itself. The first open conflict exposes the cost of this fusion. A decision is made that prioritizes stability over life. The choice is framed as tragic but necessary. The Guardians approve it. The Core enforces it. Jordan executes it without hesitation. The universe remains intact. Something else fractures. For the first time, the lantern myth loses its innocence. The light no longer merely protects. It decides who may exist within its radius. The act is justified. The consequences are managed. Yet the psychological residue lingers. Those who witness the decision cannot unsee it. Authority has crossed an invisible line. Jordan does not experience this as corruption. He experiences it as growth. The willingness to make impossible choices feels like maturity. The ring responds with increased power. Confirmation replaces reflection. The system closes ranks around him, mistaking his lack of hesitation for moral strength. This movement ends not with rebellion, but with consolidation. The Core has not yet fractured, but it has hardened. Its flexibility has narrowed. Its language has simplified. The illusion of moral certainty now rests on a single premise: that someone must decide, and that someone increasingly is Hal Jordan. The pressure continues to build. The structure holds. For now. The second movement begins when consolidation reveals its cost. Authority, once centralized, does not remain neutral. It attracts projection. As Jordan's influence expands, the core begins to reorganize itself around his interpretation of order rather than the Guardian's abstract oversight. This shift is subtle. Official structures remain intact. Protocols still exist. But gravity has moved. Decisions increasingly flow toward the figure who acts fastest and doubts least. This is the moment when the system stops correcting itself. Dissent no longer disappears quietly. It is actively repelled. Lanterns who question directives find themselves isolated, reassigned, or framed as liabilities. The language of concern replaces the language of debate. Worry is medicalized. Doubt is treated as instability. The core does not silence opposition through force. It erodes its legitimacy. Jordan's psychology adapts to this environment with alarming ease. He does not experience resistance as a signal to reflect. He experiences it as evidence that fear remains unresolved. In his internal narrative, hesitation becomes the true enemy. Those who question him are not immoral, but they are dangerous. Their uncertainty threatens the fragile order he believes he is holding together. The ring continues to obey. Constructs grow larger. Interventions become preemptive. Jordan no longer waits for crisis to manifest. He acts on probability. The future becomes something to be managed rather than encountered. This is a crucial transformation. When power shifts from response to anticipation, control becomes totalizing. The present is no longer enough. Every potential deviation becomes a target. The Guardians begin to sense that something has changed, but their response is delayed. Their detachment, once a source of perspective, now becomes paralysis. They interpret Jordan's behavior through metrics rather than meaning. Sectors stabilized. Conflicts reduced. Casualties minimized. From their vantage point, the system appears to be working. The deeper psychological transformation remains invisible to them. Other lanterns feel it immediately. The core no longer feels like a collective. It feels like an extension of a single will. Patrols become enforcements. Guidance becomes command. The oath remains the same, but its resonance shifts. What once felt like a shared commitment now feels like submission to a dominant interpretation of order. Opposition grows in response, not merely from external forces, but from within the myth itself. Former lanterns articulate a counter-narrative. They claim that fear cannot be eradicated through suppression. That disorder is not a flaw in the universe, but a condition of life. Their resistance is not chaotic. It is ideological. They reject the premise that stability requires obedience. Jordan cannot tolerate this framing. To accept it would require acknowledging that his actions are driven by fear as much as will. That his need for control is not purely altruistic. The ring offers no such mirror. It amplifies resolve without demanding insight. Power increases as self-awareness decreases. Conflict escalates accordingly. Battles become demonstrations rather than defenses. The lantern light fills the sky not as reassurance, but as warning. Territories comply through intimidation rather than trust. The core begins to resemble the very forces it once defined itself against. The difference lies only in justification. This is where polarization hardens into identity. To support Jordan is to support order. To oppose him is to align with chaos. The binary leaves no space for complexity. Lanterns must choose. Neutrality is interpreted as betrayal. Silence becomes complicity. The psychological pressure intensifies. Jordan's internal world contracts even as his external power expands. Relationships fracture. Dialogue disappears. Reflection is replaced by certainty. He no longer experiences himself as an individual making choices. He experiences himself as necessity incarnate. This self-image is nearly impossible to challenge because it absorbs all critique as confirmation of threat. The Guardians attempt intervention too late. Their authority, long symbolic, no longer carries weight. Jordan does not rebel against them openly. He simply outpaces them. Decisions are made before consensus can form. Actions are justified after the fact. The system bends around his momentum. When confrontation finally occurs, it is not framed as moral disagreement. It is framed as containment. Jordan does not see himself as opposing the core. He believes he is saving it from its own hesitation. This belief is sincere. That sincerity makes him dangerous. The second movement reaches its apex when the core fractures publicly. Lanterns turn on one another. The light clashes with itself. The myth collapses inward. What was once a symbol of unity becomes a sign of division. The universe witnesses the failure of moral certainty enacted without restraint. This rupture is irreversible. Even if Jordan were removed, the illusion would remain broken. The core has revealed its core assumption. That order justifies control. That power grants clarity. That fear can be eliminated rather than integrated. The system survives, but it is no longer innocent. The third movement unfolds not as a climax of force, but as an exposure. The conflict has already done its deepest work. What remains is the slow revelation of what the Green Lantern Corps has become under sustained pressure. Power continues to circulate. Rings still function. The Guardians still exist. Yet the system no longer believes in itself the way it once did. Its symbols persist, but their meaning has shifted. Jordan's position is no longer purely aggressive. It becomes defensive. Having reorganized reality around his will, he must now maintain it against erosion. This is the paradox of absolute control. The more territory it occupies, the more surface area it must defend. Every act of enforcement creates new resistance. Every suppression generates new fractures. The universe does not stabilize. It tightens. The lantern light, once a boundary marker, becomes a net. Movement is permitted only within defined parameters. Choice is tolerated only when it aligns with expected outcomes. The core begins to resemble a closed system, one that mistakes predictability for peace. In this environment, creativity feels subversive. Difference feels dangerous. The myth of protection reveals its hidden demand. Conformity. Jordan's internal state mirrors this contraction. His certainty, once expansive, becomes brittle. He can no longer afford ambiguity. Doubt threatens collapse. The ring still obeys, but its obedience now reinforces a shrinking world. Constructs become rigid. Solutions repeat themselves. The imagination narrows. What began as will hardens into compulsion. Other lanterns respond in divergent ways. Some double down, finding safety in obedience. Others disengage emotionally, performing their duties without belief. A few defect entirely, no longer able to reconcile their lived experience with the core's narrative. These responses fracture the collective psyche. The core remains operational, but its cohesion dissolves. The Guardians attempt restoration through reform. Committees are formed. Restrictions are debated. Oversight is promised. But these gestures feel symbolic rather than transformative. The damage is not procedural. It is psychological. The core has learned to equate authority with righteousness. That association cannot be undone through regulation alone. External forces exploit this vulnerability. Not because they are inherently malicious, but because the core's rigidity makes it predictable. Enemies adapt. Resistance becomes strategic. The universe pushes back not out of spite, but out of necessity. Life resists containment. Jordan interprets this resistance as validation of his worldview. The more opposition he encounters, the more convinced he becomes of the need for control. This feedback loop is self-reinforcing. Power isolates. Isolation intensifies conviction. Conviction demands further power. The cycle accelerates. Eventually, the confrontation becomes unavoidable. Not a battle of strength, but of legitimacy. The core must decide whether it still recognizes itself in what it has become. This decision does not occur in a single moment. It unfolds across countless small refusals. Lanterns hesitate. Orders are questioned. Commands go unanswered. The net loosens. Jordan experiences this as betrayal. The system he believed he embodied no longer responds uniformly. His authority, once absolute, encounters friction. The ring still answers his will, but the world does not. Reality reasserts its complexity. The final break is not a defeat. It is a collapse of narrative. Jordan's story as necessary savior cannot survive contradiction. When confronted with the cost of his certainty, the myth fractures. He is no longer the embodiment of order. He is a symptom of its failure. The core intervenes, not to punish, but to contain the damage. Jordan is removed from the center. The immediate threat subsides, but the illusion cannot be restored. The lantern light has illuminated its own shadow. This movement ends not with resolution, but with recognition. Power without introspection does not create peace. It creates repetition. The core survives, but it emerges altered. Its authority diminished. Its certainty eroded. The universe remains contested. What follows is not recovery. It is reckoning. When the Green Lantern core fractures, the damage does not remain confined to its internal hierarchy. The rupture reverberates outward, reshaping the symbolic landscape through which power, order, and heroism are understood. What collapses is not merely a command structure, but a fantasy deeply embedded in the cultural imagination. The idea that moral clarity can be centralized, that authority, when sufficiently elevated, can transcend human limitation. The core ceases to function as reassurance and begins to operate as a warning. Within the universe of the narrative, entire civilizations reassess their relationship to protection. Worlds that once welcomed the lantern light now regard it with suspicion. The presence of a ring no longer signals safety alone. It signals surveillance, intervention, judgment. The boundary between guardian and governor has been exposed, and once visible, it cannot be unseen. Trust, once assumed, must now be negotiated. This shift alters how collective identity forms around the core. Previously, the lantern symbol functioned as a unifying emblem. It condensed complexity into a single image of order. After the fracture, the same symbol becomes contested territory. Different groups project incompatible meanings onto it. For some, it remains a necessary bulwark against chaos. For others, it embodies the trauma of imposed stability. The symbol fractures into echoes. Culturally, this mirrors a familiar pattern. Institutions that promise safety through control often rely on mythic simplicity. They draw their legitimacy from the belief that complexity can be managed without loss. When that belief collapses, the institution does not simply lose power. It loses narrative coherence. Competing interpretations rush in to fill the vacuum. The core becomes a site of symbolic struggle. Its history is reinterpreted. Past interventions are re-examined. Actions once framed as heroic are reread as coercive. The archive itself becomes unstable. Memory reorganizes around new questions. Who benefited from order? Who paid its price? What forms of life were excluded in the name of stability? Audiences encountering this narrative respond with projection. The core no longer functions as pure fantasy. It resonates with lived experience. Viewers recognize the pattern of authority that begins with protection and ends with domination. The lanterns become mirrors for modern anxieties around policing, governance, and institutional overreach. The cosmic scale does not distance the story. It amplifies it. The figure of Hal Jordan occupies a central symbolic role in this reception. He is not read simply as a fallen hero. He becomes a vessel for collective ambivalence about leadership. His sincerity complicates judgment. He does not seek power for pleasure. He seeks resolution. This makes his transformation unsettling rather than comforting. It suggests that corruption does not require malice. It requires certainty without self-awareness. The narrative invites identification and recoil simultaneously. Jordan's desire to fix what feels broken is familiar. His inability to tolerate uncertainty is recognizable. The audience is not asked to condemn him outright. They are asked to notice how easily good intentions align with authoritarian impulse when reinforced by power. This recognition lingers. Symbolically, the core illustrates how systems externalize shadow. By defining itself as light, it displaces darkness outward. Enemies are framed as embodiments of fear, chaos, or corruption. This projection allows the system to avoid examining its own capacity for harm. When the projection collapses, shadow returns inward. The core must confront what it has denied. This inward turn destabilizes collective identity. Lanterns can no longer rely on the myth to define themselves. Individual responsibility resurfaces. Moral judgment can no longer be outsourced to the Ring or the Guardians. This produces anxiety, but also possibility. Identity becomes fluid again. Choice re-enters the frame. From a media perspective, the longevity of the Green Lantern myth owes much to this instability. Stories that preserve perfect order stagnate. Stories that fracture under pressure evolve. The core's failure allows it to remain culturally relevant. It absorbs critique without dissolving entirely. Its contradictions generate narrative energy. The visual language of the lantern light also shifts in cultural perception. Once a beacon, it becomes an interrogation lamp. Its glow no longer reassures. It exposes. This change reflects a broader shift in how visibility functions. Power that illuminates also surveils. Transparency, once celebrated, becomes ambiguous. Who controls the light matters. The core's structure echoes modern forms of global authority. Distributed agents operating under centralized oversight. A promise of neutrality paired with selective enforcement. The narrative captures the psychological cost of maintaining such systems. Burnout, alienation, moral injury. These themes resonate beyond fiction. Tribalism emerges as a secondary effect. Audiences divide in their interpretation of the core. Some defend its necessity. Others focus on its excesses. The narrative becomes a symbolic arena where broader cultural debates play out. Security versus freedom. Order versus change. Authority versus agency. The core does not resolve these tensions. It stages them. Importantly, the story resists moral purification. There is no clean alternative offered. Chaos is not romanticized. The failure of the core does not imply that order is unnecessary. It suggests that order, when divorced from humility, becomes destructive. This nuance prevents the narrative from collapsing into cynicism. The cultural impact of the Green Lantern core lies in its refusal to stabilize meaning. Its symbols remain active. They provoke interpretation rather than closure. The myth evolves alongside its audience, absorbing new anxieties as contexts shift. Each era finds its own reflection in the lantern light. What persists is a question rather than an answer. How much certainty can power afford before it becomes blind? How much order can be imposed before it erases what it claims to protect? The core endures not because it solves these questions, but because it cannot escape them. What remains after the fracture of the Green Lantern core is not ruins, but sediment. Layers of meaning settle over the institution, over its symbols, over the figures who once embodied its promise. The core continues to exist, to patrol, to intervene. Yet it does so within a changed psychological climate. The universe no longer experiences the lantern light as self-evident authority. It experiences it as history. This shift is the true legacy. Order survives, but innocence does not. Every future action is now haunted by precedent. Every intervention carries an echo of overreach. The core cannot return to its original posture because that posture depended on forgetting its own shadow. Having seen what certainty can produce when amplified by power, the system is forced into a more fragile equilibrium. The Guardians themselves are altered by this recognition, even if they resist naming it. Their authority is no longer absolute in the symbolic sense. They may still command, but they are no longer unquestioned. Distance, once their greatest strength, now reads as liability. Their long view of history has been punctured by the immediacy of consequence. They are custodians of a system that has learned it can fail. For the Lanterns, identity becomes more complex. The ring no longer offers a complete answer to who they are. Will remains necessary, but it is no longer sufficient. To wield power without reflection now feels dangerous rather than heroic. This introduces tension into the role itself. The Lantern must navigate between obedience and judgment, between service and agency. The uniform no longer erases the self. It demands confrontation with it. Hal Jordan's legacy is especially unstable. He does not settle cleanly into the category of villain or martyr. He remains suspended as a warning embedded within the myth. His story resists simplification because it exposes an uncomfortable truth: that the line between protector and tyrant is not crossed through cruelty, but through conviction unexamined. Jordan becomes a symbol of how easily the desire to save the world can transform into the need to control it. This ambiguity ensures that his presence continues to shape the core long after his removal from power. Every Lantern who acts decisively risks being compared to him. Every escalation invites his shadow. His name becomes shorthand for a specific failure of imagination. The inability to tolerate uncertainty. The refusal to share authority. The conflation of order with virtue. At a structural level, the core never fully resolves the contradiction that produced him. It cannot. The system still depends on centralized enforcement. It still relies on individuals whose will must exceed that of others. The conditions that allowed Jordan to rise remain intact. What changes is awareness. The core knows now what it is capable of becoming. This knowledge produces restraint, but also hesitation. Response times slow. Debate re-enters decision-making. From one perspective, this looks like progress. From another, it looks like vulnerability. The universe does not pause while the core reflects. Threats continue to emerge. Lives remain at risk. The tension between speed and deliberation becomes permanent. The lantern light, once an unambiguous beacon, now carries weight. Its presence signals not only intervention but scrutiny, both of the external world and of the core itself. Power is no longer exercised without anticipation of judgment. This alters the emotional texture of enforcement. Confidence gives way to vigilance. Authority becomes self-conscious. Culturally, the Green Lantern Corps settles into its role as a myth of limits. It no longer represents the fantasy of perfect order. It represents the cost of attempting it. This shift aligns the Corps with a more modern understanding of power, one that recognizes systems as dynamic, fallible, and shaped by those who inhabit them. The enduring appeal of the Corps lies precisely in this tension. It continues to attract audiences because it refuses to offer comfort. Its legacy is not reassurance, but clarity. It shows that no amount of structure can eliminate the need for ethical engagement, that no institution can substitute for moral responsibility. That power, when insulated from introspection, will reproduce the very chaos it seeks to suppress. The Corps also leaves behind a transformed symbolic geography. Territory is no longer imagined as something to be controlled from above. It is recognized as lived space. Context matters. Local meaning matters. The fantasy of universal governance collapses under the weight of particularity. This does not end intervention, but it complicates it. In the aftermath, the Corps becomes a site of ongoing negotiation rather than final authority. Its role shifts from arbiter to participant. This change does not resolve conflict. It redistributes it. Moral certainty gives way to moral labor. Order becomes provisional. Stability becomes contingent. The final legacy of the Green Lantern Corps is not collapse, but endurance under strain. A system that continues despite having lost the illusion that sustained it. This endurance is quieter, less radiant. It lacks the mythic simplicity of earlier eras, but it is more honest. The conflict does not end. It embeds itself into the ongoing life of the narrative. Each new generation of lanterns inherits not only the ring, but the memory of its misuse. Each oath spoken now carries an unspoken clause. Power must be watched, even when it believes itself righteous. This is why the Corps persists as a psychological myth, not because it promises salvation, but because it stages a dilemma that cannot be solved once and for all. How to hold order without becoming its prisoner. How to wield certainty without erasing doubt. How to protect without owning what is protected. The Green Lantern Corps does not offer answers. It offers a mirror held at cosmic scale. And what it reflects again and again is the human ego struggling to reconcile its desire for control with the irreducible complexity of life. That struggle does not fade. It remains, illuminated, unresolved, enduring.